Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about my melee predictions for patch 10.1 of Dragonflight. Season 2 is just around the corner, and I feel like it's time to put out a predictions video and give you guys my ideas as to where I think the specs are going to be rated once the season comes out and people start running keys and doing the raid. Now, just a quick disclaimer before we begin this video, I want to say that, again, this is a predictions video. This is not something that's set in stone, so take all of my predictions with a grain of salt. I could be wrong on everything, or I could be right on some things. Either way, I think it's fun to make these kind of videos and look back and kind of see how right or how wrong I was. Real quick before we begin, if you guys like these kinds of videos, be sure to leave a like on this and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. So with that being said, let's get started. Alright, first up, let's begin with the Fury Warrior, also my main for the season. So looking back at last season, for Mythic Plus, they were A tier, and for raids, I would say B. For Mythic Plus, they make about 10% of the population when you look at timed keys for plus 20 and above. Their tier set is actually pretty strong. They're an easy spec to play. However, I will say that when it comes to utility, for Mythic Plus specifically, they're kind of lacking in that department. For just Mythic Plus, they're one of the specs where you're just going to really need to have really good tuning to get in those high keys and get some invites into those kind of groups. But when you look at raiding, their utility is actually really good. So Battle Shout and Rallying Cry are both always needed for raids. Overall, I would say if I was going to rate these guys for raiding for the new tier, I'd put them in A, and then for Mythic Plus for Season 2, A tier as well. And now looking at their counterpart, the Arms Warrior. So looking back at Season 1, for Mythic Plus, they were B tier, and then for raiding, they were A tier. When you look at the player population for timed keys on plus 20s and above, Arms Warriors made about 8% of the population, so a little bit lower than Fury. Their tier set is okay, it's not the best, but it's also not terrible either. I feel like going into Season 2, Arms Warriors are just kind of behind Fury in pretty much every aspect of the game, except two situations. So the first one is just pure execute phases for boss fights, and 2-target cleave fights. I think the go-to for Season 2 is to main Fury, but then also play Arms as a backup for certain situations. So for my rating for Arms Warriors, I'm going to put them in the B tier for both Mythic Plus and for rating. Now let's talk about the Ret Paladin. So right off the bat, Ret Paladin got that huge rework, so that was really awesome. They finished up last tier for Mythic Plus and for rating, both in S tier, in my opinion. They made up about 16% of the population for timed plus 20 keys and above for Mythic Plus. And looking forward, their tier set actually looks really good. And like I mentioned, that rework just made them so much better to play. They're a lot more fun. They've got a lot more survivability than before. So the way that their talents got swapped out basically allows them to kind of move their points around and really gives them a lot of flexibility for different situations. I would say going forward, Ret Paladins are definitely going to be the flavor of the month spec for the game, and for Season 2, I'm going to put them in the S tier for both Mythic Plus and rating. I think they're not going anywhere, they're going to be super good going forward, and they're probably going to be getting nerfed. Now let's talk about everybody's favorite underdog spec, the Survival Hunter. So looking back at Season 1, Survival wasn't very good in Mythic Plus, and they were even worse in the raid. When you look at the timed plus 20 keys and above for Mythic Plus, Survival Hunters made up only 1% of the population. That's really bad. And unfortunately, up until recently, their tier set was actually really strong. People on the PTR were just doing really good numbers as far as survival in like Mythic Plus. But their tier set got a pretty big series of nerfs, so they're kind of back down to like middle of the pack now. And unfortunately, Survival Hunters don't have a ton of good utility, and they're kind of lacking as far as survivability goes. They're one of the specs that are just going to be entirely dependent on tuning as far as how good or bad they are. So looking forward at Season 2, I'm going to put them in the B tier. Next up, we've got the Subtlety Rogue. So looking back at Season 1, they were an S tier spec for Mythic Plus, and an A tier spec for raids. They made about 10% of the population for timed plus 20 keys and above. Their tier set actually looks pretty good, and they're one of those specs that just scales really well with gear over time. And of course, they are a rogue, so they have great defensives. And I think going forward for Season 2, I'm going to place them in the B tier for the raid, and A tier for Mythic Plus. And now let's talk about the Outlaw Rogue. So for Season 1, they were an A tier for Mythic Plus, and B tier for the raid. They made up about 8% of the population for timed plus 20 keys and above, so a little bit lower than Subtlety Rogues, and they just have a really strong damage profile for AoE and just really good for Mythic Plus. Again, Rogue, so great defensives. So I think for Season 2, I'm going to put them very similar to Subtlety Rogue, so B tier for the raid and A tier for Mythic Plus. And now the last rogue spec, the Assassination Rogue. So Assassination is the weakest of the rogue specs. If you looked at Season 1 for Mythic Plus, they were B tier, and for the raid, they were even worse in the D tier. Just like Survival Hunters, they only made up about 1% of the population when you looked at plus 20 keys and above for timed Mythic Plus. And the thing with Assassination Rogues is they just never really had a good profile for AoE damage. They're mainly just really good at just pure single target. So that's kind of like their strong point. So for Season 2, I think for the raid, they're going to be B tier, and then for Mythic Plus, they'll be C tier. And now we move on to the Unholy Death Knight. So for Season 1, they were a B tier spec for Mythic Plus, and for the raid, they were S tier. They made up about 7% of the population when you looked at plus 20 keys and above for timed Mythic Plus. And as far as their tier set goes, Unholy got a really good tier set. I keep hearing about how strong it's going to be, and it's like even stronger than the last tier set they had, so it's going to be pretty cool to see. Unholy Death Knights have some really good utility, especially for raiding with AMS and all the different types of death grips they can do. So for Season 2, I'm going to put them in S tier for both Mythic Plus and raiding. So Frost Death Knights didn't get as good of a job as Unholy did this time around. If you look at them in Season 1, they were an F tier spec for Mythic Plus and C tier for raiding. Only 2% of the population made it for plus 20 keys and above for Mythic Plus. And as far as their tier set goes, it's going to be buffing their AoE by quite a bit. However, the one thing that really sucks about Frost is that the tier set is all about the Breath build, and unfortunately, the Breath of Sindragosa is just not a very good spell for Mythic Plus. So with all that being said, I do think that they are going to be in a little bit better of a spot than they were last tier. So when you look at all that, I am going to say that for Season 2, for raiding, they're going to be a B tier spec, and then for Mythic Plus, I'm going to put them in the C tier. Enhancement Shamans have just been killing it in the game recently, and I think that's not going to stop going forward. For Season 1, they were a S tier spec for Mythic Plus, and for raiding, they were a B tier spec. They made up about 8% of the population for plus 20 keys and above for Mythic Plus. And while they did get some recent nerfs to their tier set, it's still looking like they're going to be really strong. They've got some solid utility, like Bloodlust and a self-res. So going forward with Season 2, I think for raiding, they're going to be A tier, and for Mythic Plus, they're going to be an S tier. Now on to the Windwalker Monk. So when we look at them from last season, for Mythic Plus, they were A tier, and for raiding, they were B tier. They made up about 9% of the population for plus 20 keys and above timed Mythic Plus. Looking forward, they've got a pretty strong tier set for Season 2, and they actually just got some buffs to their single target damage, which is always awesome, because they've always just had a really strong AoE damage profile. So now that they've got some single target buffs, they're going to be pretty good. Windwalkers are super mobile, they've got some really good utility like an AoE stun, Ring of Peace, and for the raid, they bring that awesome physical damage buff. So for Season 2, I'm going to put them in the B tier for the raid, and S tier for Mythic Plus. In Season 1, Feral Druid for Mythic Plus was an A tier spec, and for the raid, they were pretty down there in the D tier. They make up about 5% of the melee population for plus 20 keys timed and above, and from what I've seen, they've actually got a pretty strong tier set. They have some really good utility with things like Mark of the Wild, Stampeding Roar, and I feel like this time around, Feral is actually going to be kind of the sleeper spec going forward. I don't think a lot of people even consider playing Feral, but I think it's actually going to be a really solid pick. So for next tier, I think I'm going to put them in the A tier for Mythic Plus, and for raid, I'm going to put them in the C tier, mainly because I feel like they just don't bring a lot of other stuff to the table as far as all the other kind of melee specs do, because melee has just always been a spot in the raid that's just really hard to get into unless you have some really strong raid-wide utility. So if Feral's going to be doing good in the raid, it's all just going to boil down to tuning as far as their damage numbers goes. And last but not least, let's talk about the Havoc Demon Hunter. So for Season 1, they were an S tier spec for both Mythic Plus and for rating. They took up about 14% of the population for timed plus 20 keys and above in Mythic Plus. And then, unfortunately, it seems like their tier set is actually kind of meh. A lot of people are not happy with it. And on top of that, it's actually gotten some nerfs recently too, which kind of sucks. But I will say that Havoc has always had some really good damage profiles as far as Mythic Plus goes. They've got some really good utility with like an AoE stun. Plus, you'll always want to have one in your raid for that magic damage buff to help your casters out. And this last point is more of a personal preference kind of thing. I personally do not like Essence Break. I don't like the build and how that feels to play. It just, I don't know, some people like it, I don't like it. I guess it's maybe because I'm a smooth brain. But either way, I think for Season 2, I'm going to put the Havoc Demon Hunter in the C tier for the raid and A tier for Mythic Plus. And that'll just about wrap up this video for my predictions tier list. What are your guys' thoughts on the specs going forward? Do you guys think that I'm pretty accurate, or do you guys think I'm off on a bunch of them? Either way, let me know how right or wrong I am in the comments. If you guys got something out of this video, I would really appreciate it if you left a like to let me know, and also subscribe to the channel if you guys are new here. I'm working really hard to put out some good content for you guys on the game and keep you updated on things you guys need to know about. And one quick thing I just want to say about my content in general. I'm not going to be getting everything right 100% of the time. I make mistakes just like everybody else, and I really appreciate it when you guys let me know in the comments when I am wrong, so that way every new video I can always try to improve and try to make things better for you guys. So yeah, I just want to say I really appreciate all the support you guys have given me so far, and I'm really excited for the future and just putting out more content for you guys. So with all that being said, I will see you guys later.